So the idea today then is the truth that it's not how a person begins their Christian life that matters. It's how a person perseveres, and it's how the Christian life ends. Beginning last Sunday morning then with Job, we saw that the end of Job, the end of his story, was better than his beginning. So the idea is, it's not how we come to Christ, it's not how our Christian life starts, but it's whether or not that life as a Christian ends because we have persevered throughout. So starting a new year then, we are starting with the idea that we need to persevere in the faith. We need to persevere as Christians in our homes, in the workplace, in our communities. We have to persevere in trusting and believing and praying, and we have to persevere in fellowship. Now, let me just add, I didn't intend to say this, but let me just add that the dangers in the Christian life are not dramatic. They do not come in the form of visions or great dramas. The dangers in the Christian life are very ordinary, and they are made up of choices. And I think the dangers are these, that without realizing, we make choices that when they add up, they have a harmful effect on our Christian lives. Everyday choices, small ones made in the families and in the homes. And so the dangers to us persevering aren't the dramatic things in life, but the small and the ordinary and the everyday. Now, this morning we identified 5 truths which, if we hold on to, truths about God, we'll be encouraged to persevere. So looking at James and 1 John, we saw this morning that God is always good, that God is the God who gives, that God is a gracious God. And we reminded ourselves of these truths. God is greater. And then finally, this morning we said, didn't we? God knows all things. Well, tonight what I want to do, looking at these 20 verses in Philippians, I want to look at 5 habits which, if we practice every day in our Christian lives, we'll be encouraged and we'll persevere. So as this morning, then, if you can make note of these 5 things and then write them down and keep them at home as a reminder day by day. So let's turn then to Philippians 4, and from verse 1 to verse 20, I want to pick out 5 things. Now, Paul is very keen here for the Christians to stand fast in the Lord. Look at verse 1. He says, "My beloved brethren, my longed for brethren, stand fast in the Lord." Now, that's always the call of the New Testament, to stand fast. And many of you know that the little word "so" that you'll see in the middle of this verse means in this way. So we really shouldn't translate it as "so." We should see that that one word is laying out for us how to do something. And Paul is very concerned then that he states for this church how they can follow certain steps. And by doing so, they'll stand fast in the Lord. Now, I'm not going through the order that Paul lays down, and I'm not just sticking to verses 1 through to 9, where the steps are more clear. Let's range around these verses and see what Paul has to say. So first of all, will you start in verse 6? Verse 6, very familiar verse. We looked at it just a few months ago. The first habit is this: be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. What I want to say as the first good habit to develop every day is the habit of giving thanks to God. Now, in the year to come, we can either have the outlook on life in which we see the challenges and we see the hardships and we talk about the responsibility. So all we do is focus on what's going to be difficult, or we can develop the mindset in which we think about every day the reasons we have to be thankful. What's good about the day? Now, if you take a look at these verses, verse 6 especially, the danger always is, because we are thinking about what's wrong all the time, that we fail to appreciate what's right. Now, we can look around here tonight, can't we, and we can think about what's wrong. And what's wrong is that there are many who are unwell, that we are few, that Sunday nights are increasingly a challenge. We can look around and see what's wrong in terms of the fellowship more generally. We can see what's wrong with my life, what's wrong with your life, and that becomes our outlook. What I want us to try and develop here is looking at what's right, looking at what's good, looking at what we have, looking at what's true, and just taking a moment every day to look at what's right and to give thanks to God for it. And that's what Paul is developing here. So he's encouraging them to pray, but what he's not encouraging them to do is just to focus in your prayers on what you want God to do for you. The focus in our prayers is a rejoicing in who God is and a rejoicing in what he's like and what's true about him. Do you remember, some of you who were there on Wednesday? That's what we talked about together. We don't rush in with our lists. We don't talk about all the challenges. We offer thanks to God. And that's what I'd like us to do. We are very familiar with what's wrong, aren't we? So let's try and cultivate that habit in which we acknowledge before God what is good from his hand. So that's the first one. And then if you take a look from verse 10 down to verse 20, some of you will remember that in these 10 verses, verse 10 to verse 20, the Apostle Paul is trying to say thank you to the church at Philippi. But he's finding it difficult to say thank you. And Paul's difficulty is not because he's feeling a bit mean. It's not because he's ungrateful, but he wants to get it right, his words of thanks. So what is he saying thank you for? Well, if you take a look at verse 18, you get the idea. And the idea is that Paul is in prison, and the church at Philippi sent Paul a gift. Now, it was probably a gift of money, and they sent Epaphroditus with the money. Now, Paul had waited a long time for the church at Philippi to send him a gift, to show their concern. And Paul, just like anybody else, he was tempted to think that the church at Philippi didn't care about him. And I know all of us can identify with Paul. Sometimes we go through challenging times, and nobody rings from the church to see how we are. Nobody asks us. Nobody pays us a visit. Nobody seems concerned at all. Now, Paul was in that position, but he refused to think the worst about the church at Philippi. He didn't want to think that they didn't care about him. So instead, what he said in verse 10 is that they just were too busy. They lacked the opportunity to do good to him. But eventually, Epaphroditus rolls up at the prison and he brings the gift from the church. The second habit that will be good for us to develop over the new year is giving. Giving to one another. Now, the great danger, I think, is taking. And I think, I must admit, there's an element of taking in the life of the church. We turn up and we want to hear a good sermon. We come to prayer meeting and we want it to be good. We come to Bible study and we want to get something from it. And all the time we are thinking about what we get from. Now, the new habit is this. Let's give to. Let's seek in the new year to give to one another, to give our time, to give our concern. Now, I'm sure much of this goes on, and I'm sure, too, that I don't know what exactly does go on. But the habit of giving is so much more important than always thinking about what we get out of something. So here's a challenge. When you come on a Sunday, is your concern about what you get out of the service? Or is your concern what you give to the service? One of the things that helps a preacher is for the listener to be giving something back as the minister preaches. Any preacher will tell you, he knows those in the congregation who are just taking from him and those who are giving back, even in the act of listening. So the second habit then, we see it here in this church, it's giving. Giving to one another. Seeking to help each other. Seeking to show a concern to each other. Now, what I'm hoping is, and I can be quite confident, I think, that there are not many like it, but there used to be, people in the church who grew very bitter because they thought nobody cared about them. The question isn't, who cares about me? The question is, who do I show care to? And that's the second habit here. Who are you showing concern for in the fellowship? How do you show it? How do you demonstrate the concern that you have for those with whom you worship? Don't be like some who say, oh, nobody cares about me. Paul refused to think that. Look at verse 10. The idea is the more we give to one another, then the more we are encouraged and the more we continue in the Christian life. So habit number 1 is giving thanks. Then let's talk about giving our concern and our care to one another. And then let's look at verse 9. And I think verse 9 is really important. Paul is summing up his final habit here for the Christians at Philippi. And he says, the things that you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do. And that little phrase, these do, is a phrase that's derived from the habit of learning. And what Paul never, ever stops doing is learning. And I want to encourage you to seek to learn in the year ahead. So to encourage the church, look down the verses, and Paul tells them what he has learned. And he says, doesn't he, that he has learned in every situation, verse 11, to be content. So he's sharing what he has learned, so that the church at Philippi don't think that Paul is above learning, that Paul is such a super impossible apostle that he's got nothing to learn. He shares what he has learned, and he's encouraging them to go on learning. Do you remember in chapter 3, he talks about how he's seeking to learn more about Christ. Now, can I encourage you in the year ahead to learn? And in a sense, I hope you don't mind me saying it, in a sense, it doesn't matter what you learn. If you look at verse 8, you can learn a language, you can learn a subject, you could go to night school. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we continue to learn. Now, ideally, the things to learn are scriptural things. We need to learn more about our Bibles. But we also continue in the faith just by learning new things. Now, some of you are going to say to me that you're too old. You're never too old. And if nothing else, what we need to learn in the year ahead, we need to learn more about ourselves. And we need to learn more about each other. So be interested in other people. You see, it's not about talking to other people about ourselves. It's about encouraging other people to talk to us about how they are. We shouldn't go around telling people our stories. Let's be curious about what's going on in the lives of others and find out about how so-and-so is and what's going on in somebody's life. And we show that interest, that curiosity, that desire to learn about one another. So learn a subject, learn more about your Bibles, learn about yourself, learn about each other, as long as we have a willingness in the year ahead to learn. So what have we said so far? Let's give thanks every day. Let's give thanks to God for tonight, for those who are here. Let's give thanks for each other. Let's give thanks every day. Find some reason, something in which you can be rejoicing in every day that we live in the year to come. Practice giving to each other and learning. Well, there's two more, and I want to take a word that many of you dislike, and it's again found in these verses. Let's look at verse 11. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned, so here's Paul now learning himself, in whatever state I am, to be content. This word, some of you I've said already don't like it. And it's a word that many people misunderstand. And I know that over the years, I've tried to explain to you what this word means. And I don't really want to go into the discussion with you again. So what I want to say is this: the idea of contentment is the idea of not letting your thoughts run ahead. So that if you're on a Sunday and you're in church, you are not letting your thoughts run ahead to what you may be doing Wednesday, or what may happen Thursday, or what you imagine could be the case Friday, or what would go on in April or summer or next Christmas. It's not letting your thoughts run ahead of what is already the case. Now that's what Paul has learned. So let's understand how he's done that. He's in prison. It's the first time he's in prison. And we don't know, we think that by the time he writes this letter, he's had his trial. So we think that he's not sure what the verdict will be. So the trial has taken place, and if you like, the judge has retired to consider the punishment. Now put yourself in Paul's position. Paul could easily start imagining what's going to happen to him. Is he going to be set free? Is he going to be killed, executed? Will he have to pay a fine? Is he going to be sent to prison? Will he become some kind of forced laborer somewhere? Now, it's easy, isn't it, in Paul's position to let your imagination run away with you and to begin to imagine. And when you do imagine, what do you always imagine? And you always imagine the worst. You come in your thoughts to the worst possible outcome about that thing that you're afraid of. Now, contentment is keeping your thoughts in the present moment. Keeping your thoughts in the here and now. Not giving those thoughts free rein to run wild. And what we tend to do is this. There's something that we are worried about. So we let that thought run wild in our imagination. And we start to tell ourselves a story. Now, the thought could be about our health. The thought could be about the church. The thought could be about our children. There's something that we are worried about, and we let that whole thing run riot in our heads. And we imagine the worst. And before we know it, the whole scene has been conjured up in our heads, and we can visualize it. It's all there as if we are watching it. And it's some terrible tragedy unfolding inside our heads. Now, contentment is keeping your thoughts in the present moment. And the idea is this. Every past moment has gone. Whatever you did yesterday, it's gone. When this day is over, today will be gone. So you don't hold on to what has gone. It's already gone. And that's what Paul has told the church in chapter 3 when he says, forgetting that which is behind. So don't hold on to what you did yesterday, to what somebody said yesterday, to what somebody didn't do yesterday. Don't hold on to what you did 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. You let go of what's gone on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you say the future moments haven't arrived yet. The past is gone. Tomorrow is yet to come. The only moment I got is now. That's all God has given me. He's given me this moment, on this day, in this place, at this time. That's all I have. And you keep your thoughts in that present moment. That's the idea of contentment. So you don't allow the past to have an impact on you in the present. You don't allow the future to worry you in the present. You keep your attention in the here and now. And Paul is building, isn't he, on what Jesus himself taught. So let's make sure I got the right verse. Will you turn to Matthew and chapter 6? Do you remember chapter 6 of the Sermon on the Mount? And Jesus has been dealing with, do not worry about what you shall eat. Don't worry about what you shall wear. Your heavenly Father knows what you have need of. And do you remember how the passage ends? Look at Matthew 6 and verse 34. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. And that's this idea of contentment. Tomorrow, you'll get all the grace you need tomorrow. Tomorrow will look after itself. Sufficient is the same word, contentment, is for the day. Contentment is keeping your thoughts in the day. Now, hopefully some of you will say to me, well, Neil, you know, a new year is starting. We've got things to plan. We've got decisions to make. Doesn't that mean we shouldn't think about these things? And of course the answer is no. There's a world of difference between choosing to plan your holiday or to plan what you want to do. There's a world of difference between that and then letting your thoughts run riot and imagining the worst when you've got no evidence. And it's that I'm talking to you about. So as an example, and I've used this example before, I think, some of you in a sermon will find your minds wandering. Some thought has come to you. As you sit there in these wonderful pews of ours, some thought will come. And what you find is you are then hooked by that thought and you start to dwell on it. And you go ahead of yourself. And you're imagining something, and you're thinking something, and you're building up some picture about what hasn't happened yet. That's what I'm talking to you about. Contentment is keeping your thoughts in the present moment. So if in the present moment you want to plan, great. But it's when those thoughts come and they trick you, and they're based on fear. And you start to fear something and imagining the worst. That's what this verse is about. Paul has learned not to let the past haunt him in the present and not to let the future fill him with fear. He has the present time, and that's what he holds on to. Well, time has gone then, so let's do our last habit. And I guess this last habit runs throughout these verses 10 to 20. I told you that Paul wants to say thank you, but he's finding it difficult. And Paul's difficulties, they are theological. Because if he says on the one hand, now look guys, I was waiting for months for you to help me, and I had no money, and I was able to buy no food, and I was starving, the church may say, well, Paul, didn't God look after you? So that's the danger on the one hand. And then on the other hand, if he doesn't say thank you, because really he didn't need the money, then that looks like he's not appreciating what the church has done. So what Paul does is this. Throughout these verses 10 to 20, he's telling them that in his present situation, he was sustained by always hoping in God. So whether it was a day of food or a day of starvation, whether he had a good day in prison or whether it was a bad day, he always hoped in God. His confidence was in the wisdom and the care and the purpose and the plans of God. And that's where I want us to end today. We need to encourage ourselves every day to hope in God, to hope in God's purpose for ourselves. So I want to encourage myself to hope that God's purpose for me in the year ahead is greater than any challenge I face. It's greater than any sin I could commit. It's greater than any thought I might have. The purposes of God that cannot fail. Encourage yourself in those purposes. God has chosen you. He has loved you. He gave his son for you. Encourage yourself to hope in God. I want to encourage you to hope in God for our church. God has sent his son to die for the church. And the Son of God shed his blood for the church. And God promised him that he would have a bride, that he would have a people, that he would have a body. Now, God is not letting his son die for his church to fail. So let's encourage one another to hope in God for the year ahead, for the church to which we belong, for the services that we attend, for the witness that we are part of. Let's encourage ourselves to hope in God. Now, what the danger is this. It's very easy to discourage ourselves. And I want to warn you, don't discourage yourself in the year ahead. As you look at yourself, don't find reasons why you're so awful as a Christian. As you look at yourself, hope in God for who you are as a Christian, for what your future is as a Christian, for what God's purposes are for you as a Christian. Encourage yourself, not discourage yourself. And you know, it's so important that we don't discourage each other. We know what the problems are. We said this morning, didn't we? God knows all things. He knows every reason for everyone in our fellowship, why each of us are like we are, the pressures that we're under, the demands we face, the responsibilities we carry. God knows all things. And God is encouraging us to hope in him. So don't discourage one another in the year ahead when we point out the obvious to each other. Oh, so-and-so isn't here again. There's not many of us again. We know these things. Let's encourage one another by what we have and what is the case and what God's plans are and what we can hope in. Don't discourage each other by saying, oh, well, you know, other places have closed and churches in other countries have ended. Yes, we know. And we know how easy it is to discourage one another. Let's hope in God together. And let's hope in God for our congregation. Let's hope in God for those we are praying for, those who are our children and our grandchildren and our husbands and wives and parents. Let's hope in God and encourage each other to hope in God. And as the weeks go by and we forget our sermons, let's not forget to go on hoping in God and encouraging each other to hope in God. Because as we do so, grace will be given to us. We'll be encouraged to persevere, and we'll be glorifying our God together.